pleasure, sincere pleasure, to introduce and to let us all welcome resoundingly Chris Newman.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I really appreciate that introduction, and thanks to Gail and Deb and everybody else who's worked so hard to put this conference together. I've heard what a production this can be, almost like going to war. So thank you all for doing this in the middle of a pandemic and still making this happen and giving us the opportunity to come and speak and make this kind of stuff happen. So anyway. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to start by talking about my own story and how I wound up where I am, because it's really not where I expected to be. So back in 2011, 2012, I was a tech worker. I was just a software engineer working in Washington, D.C., working for a progression of slightly less evil corporations, like starting with Lockheed Martin and then going to like a small consulting outfit that mostly worked in the nonprofit sector, which was its own weird beast of corruption, and then finally going to a small, like a very, very small boutique consulting firm whose main client was the IRS, which was full of fairly unhappy people, as you might expect, working for the IRS. So I wound up in a lifestyle where I was sleeping at work. I was living at work. Slack was on all the time. My email was always blowing up. My text messages were always blowing up. And it got to the point where I had a health scare that was a cancer scare at the age of 28, 29. So my wife decided my tech career was over, and we decided to we had a plan for starting some kind of agricultural operation at some point. We were going to make a bunch of money in tech, move out to the country somewhere, probably in Albemarle County or some other bougie place or whatever. And we were going to focus on like indigenous seed keeping and rare breeds of corn, beans, and squash, and maybe raise some bison and do stuff like that. But instead, we decided to accelerate our timeline by 35 or 40 years or so and start farming right now. So back when this happened, again, which is around like 2012, 2013, the current crop of people, the crop of people back then who were speaking about sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, people, at least not in the mainstream, kind of like we are now, weren't really talking about things like food sovereignty and food justice. There were only a couple of people out there doing that work, and they were very hard to get a hold of if you were an outsider from agriculture coming in. I was a consummate outsider. Like, you know, our interest in ag and growing things was not based on some family heritage or some long-standing desire to come onto the landscape. It was really kind of all of a sudden. So we came in really raw. And because of that, the people that popped up in Google searches and were easily accessible when you wanted to learn about how sustainable agriculture works were the people that everybody had heard of. It was the Alan Savorys, it was the Joel Salatins, I guess maybe the Greg Judys, the Bill Mollison people, the permaculture people, like all the white permaculture people that float to the top as, I don't know, cream tends to. So those were the people that we learned agriculture from. We didn't, we kind of thought that farming would be some kind of racially, culturally agnostic kind of thing, at least when it comes to the business part of it and how to run it and how to make things happen. So those are the people that we listened to. So we did what they did. Specifically, we did what Polyface and Joel Salatin does. So we got into pastured poultry, we got into broiler chickens, we got into egg-laying hens, we got into pork. We tried to get into cattle, but it was too expensive. We messed around with some produce and some little ramshackle hoop houses that we made or whatever. And it went okay, right up until the part where we realized that we needed to make a living from this if we were going to be serious about it. And the math just didn't really work out. The amount of stuff, the amount of animals we'd have to raise, the amount of crops we'd have to raise was so high that there was no way to really do it without bringing in a whole heck of a lot of people. And all the people that we saw who were doing this, who had achieved some kind of scale, were they were doing it basically by leveraging an inheritance or exploiting people, or in some cases both. So when you've got people who you're looking up to who are making their farm work by paying people like $100 a month and having them stay in housing where there might not be running water, or having woofers sleep in tents, or having people live like very unsustainable, substandard kind of lives, it became clear that there's something wrong with this. And it caused us to start interrogating this model, because again, coming from outside of agriculture, we really didn't have any particular love for kind of the gurus of agriculture who we were at that time looking up to. So we decided to kind of dig a little bit deeper. And I'm sorry, somebody's having a really loud conversation downstairs, so I'm going to move myself. So we decided that we were going to do things a little bit differently and start investigating some of the math behind the sustainable agriculture movement. I'm sorry, I'm retreating to my bedroom at this point. So we had this real kind of come to Jesus moment when, what was it? We were watching this movie. My wife and I watched this movie called War Dogs, and it's this movie about these guys who were trying to become arms dealers. And they were trying to procure weapons for the federal government using this website called FedBizOps. And it kind of reminded me that FedBizOps is a real thing that lists every single federal procurement contract in the federal government. You can buy anything on it. You can buy weapons, you can buy office supplies, and you can also buy food. And so just on a lark, I decided to look at FedBizOps and see like what some of the food procurement contracts would look like for maybe like the Army or the Marine Corps, or any kind of government agency that has to do some kind of like major food procurement. And we wound up coming across contracts to buy food for like the Bureau of Prisons. Like the Bureau of Prisons, I think buys more food than like anybody. It's really odd. But we looked at these contracts, and it would be for like a single facility in like Louisiana somewhere, or one in Mississippi. Like most of them were in the South. It was really depressing to watch because you knew what you were looking at. And a single contract for like, a 3-month meat procurement for for one of these facilities would be requesting something like 20,000 pounds of ground beef, 4,000 pounds of chicken breast, 20,000 pounds of whole chickens, something like 40,000 pre-rolled like beef burritos or carnitas burritos or something like that. The scale of these like individual line items for for one contract, for like one line item in one contract for 1 quarter for one facility, was more than the big farms that I was looking up to could produce in like 5 years. So it really got to the point where it felt like, the sustainability movement with these small farms that were having a really hard time getting their legs under them, it was kind of like throwing a handful of sand on the beach. It felt like nonsense, and that nobody that I was hearing in the movement really had a plan for what to do about it, except consumers need to educate themselves more. They need to value food more. They need to pay more for food. It was this big blame thing about how much the consumer sucks and how this is like the average person's fault. And me coming from a background where I saw what poverty looked like and what it looks like when your wages are just eroding underneath your feet, that felt like bullcrap to me. So we kind of decided we were really going to interrogate like what is actually wrong with agriculture, and what is wrong with the system of agriculture. And we were going to dig a little bit deeper than like the standard line of agribusiness is evil and farmers are having their necks stepped on, and basically poor farmer, big agribusiness is evil, Monsanto is evil, Bayer is evil, ADM is evil, Cargill is evil, Purdue is evil, and farmers are good. We started meeting people who worked in the agriculture sector who said, that's kind of a lie. So I'm going to try to share this screen because we had this kind of multi-year and awful journey of discovery about how agriculture works. So I'm going to share this real quick. I'm going to hopefully get a confirmation that this can be seen. Okay, it's viewable. Okay, great. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about the progression of how did sustainable agriculture get to be the way that it actually is. And I want to start that by, oops, let me go to my preview screen. And hang on one second, I'm not sure. There we go. Okay, so the problem with agriculture in the United States stems from America's original sin, like one of its two original sins, one of which is land theft and genocide, and the other of which is slavery. Agriculture in the United States was based on having a reason to occupy land and extract wealth from it. We have these ideas around like nostalgia and farming that, pioneers came over and they were just trying to make a living for themselves. And it was all about, independence and Jeffersonian yeomanism and, blah, blah, blah. But when you actually look at the history of the United States and how and why most of the land that was farmed, it was a plantation economy. It was about growing sugarcane and rice and tobacco, eventually corn. It was about cotton. Half of the stuff was inedible, and most of it was designed to be exported, stuff that couldn't be grown in the quantities that could be grown here overseas so it could be turned into money. Farming in this country has always been about occupying land and extracting wealth, and that really hasn't changed. When you look at statistics today around how something like 30 or 34% of all the calories produced on the ground in the United States actually becomes food, and the rest either becomes fuel or gets wasted or gets dumped in other countries to crash their agricultural economies and make them dependent on us or whatever. It's never been about producing food. It's always been about money and fortunes. As time went on, you get past the colonial era, you get past the Civil War era, you go to the turn of the century, and farming becomes more and more mechanized. Excuse me. Mechanization allows you to farm more land. And at the same time, having more land requires more mechanization. So you wind up in this vicious cycle where farms start getting bigger just because the machinery allows you to. It allows you to make more money. Farming also becomes more competitive. So the bigger guys are able to muscle out the smaller guys if they're running, a little more efficiently. So you just have this constant dance. You got more land, you need more machines. You got more machines, you can do more land. If you got more land, you need more machines, and round we go until you've got farms that are the sizes of the ones that we talk about today when we talk about land consolidation and the corporatizing of farming, which is its own kind of red herring. That's where we end up. Along with that, you wind up with rural depopulation. You have all these machines, you have all this land, you have all this stuff that's automated, and you're concentrating on a smaller and smaller segment of cash crops that you don't need so much skilled labor in order to harvest. You start to depopulate the countryside. You don't need all these people. The early 20th century, rural America used to be a hotbed of leftist, unionizing, worker-focused activity. The mechanization of farming and the occupation of more and more farmland killed that in the womb. And so these guys start leaving, the rural areas for the cities because, mechanization, you don't need the people, and farming starts becoming deprofessionalized. And that idea of farming becoming like a less than professional profession really has a lot of consequences down the road, like to this day, that affect me and my work and what I try to do. And you, of course, get an assist from racial violence because at the end of the Civil War, you had Black people, African-American people who were poised to take over agriculture because they had all the knowledge of it. They had all the engineering knowledge. They had all the plant knowledge. They had all the soil knowledge. They knew the weather patterns. They knew the contours of the ground. They knew what grew where and when and how well. And they knew the business of farming because they were handling all of it. And racist white people in the South knew that, and it freaked them out that it would destroy the racial contract and the social contract that had been enforced with violence since the country's founding, since before the country's founding. So you had the Ku Klux Klan, you had police forces, you had, you had black codes, you had Jim Crow, you had all of these things that were deliberately designed to basically take black people's birthright from them on landscapes that were the birthright of indigenous people that was also taken away. The depopulation of rural areas like this it was not an accident. As much as you'll hear farmers, cry and moan about it, on the news or whatever, if anybody watches RFD TV or whatever, this is the way they wanted it. And not just because they were introverts and wanted to like be alone, but because when you start pushing people out of rural areas, you suddenly start concentrating political power. You have a place like Wyoming that has as many senators as a place like California. You're able to stack the electoral college. You have equal representation in the Senate that gives you more representation in a bicameral legislature, even if nobody lives where you do. You have gerrymandering that affects that on the House side. And then probably most damning of all for people who want to, especially marginalized people who want to come onto landscapes and get into land-based enterprises, you have this local political dominance where a couple of families run entire rural areas. They run the towns. They control the zoning board. They control everybody who owns any land. You have these situations where nobody, especially from the outside of these places, can come in and try to do something like buy farmland or get loans or like set up a processing facility or something without the blessing of like 2 or 3 people who have a vested interest in you not being there and making their small pond where they're a big fish, making that pond bigger. They don't want that. They enjoy the power. They enjoy being those big fish in that small pond. When you control political power, you start to control money. You start to control the public purse because you've basically hacked democracy. So you wind up with wealth subsidies, and not just things like direct cash payments or whatever for the big 6 crops or whatever, but you wind up with kind of indirect subsidies that don't really exist in other businesses, like price insurance, crop insurance, biofuels and plastics, whole markets invented for these surpluses that nobody ever wanted to go. We have this problem of chronic overproduction in this country that's a relic of the Cold War. We wanted to show the Soviets how great capitalism was. So what do? We socialized farming. So we subsidized people to produce way more corn, way more soybeans or whatever than anybody could ever want. And when there's nowhere for these places to go, we invent, ethanol regulations so that they have to go somewhere. We start flexing our muscle in the global South and in certain like vulnerable agricultural economies overseas, saying, take our corn or else. And we start dumping our stuff on them. It gives us another pressure valve and outlet for all of our surplus crops, for all these rich people that are producing all this stuff, and out it goes. And you get to the point where you don't really, as a farmer, you don't really have to worry so much about making money as not losing money, because at this point where you have local political hegemony, you have these giant farms that are worth a ton of money, as long as you don't do anything crazy like chasing falling prices that aren't subsidized, which is kind of what happened in the dairy industry, you're now a rich person. You look at the USDA ERS, and the average, the median farmer, not even the average, the median farmer has a net worth approaching $900,000, and they make more money income-wise, far more than national median. So you have people that are crying poor, but they're not really poor. They're sitting on like $2 million estates, and they'll talk about the debt side of their equation. Oh God, I got $400,000 in debt, but they won't talk about the fact they have $1.2 million in equity and that they're fine at the end of the day. But anybody here that started farming from the outside, like I did, quickly realized that it's real hard to do farming, especially for a living, if you're coming from the outside, because if you don't inherit it, you're kind of screwed. You can't really afford the land. It's hard to get the loans for equipment because like the USDA local offices are also kind of controlled by their own little like crony kind of systems or whatever. There's a reason USDA has kind of localized the FSA offices, and they don't really operate under a federal mandate the way we kind of think they do. So you have a system that's inaccessible. No new people can get in. but people can sure as hell get kicked out. And that's the thing you hear about with, you know, farm consolidation and the little guys getting pushed out. What's actually happening is you have guys that are like, you know, incrementally better at farming and can get, you know, slightly better harvest than the next guy. And those guys are winning and beating out guys that maybe make bad bets. Maybe they took out too much of a mortgage to like rebuild their house or whatever. And then corn prices sank by like 10%. Now that'll get you kicked out of the game. But that's your own fault. So with this, you know, shrinking, the shrinking core of professional farmers who are getting richer and richer if they're able to stay in it, you know, these guys don't really have to worry about the market, but somebody's going to, and that somebody is going to be the Cargills, the ADMs, and the you know, the Tysons and the Purdues of the world, the JBSs of the world. They're going to see all these cheap subsidized commodities coming out and saying, dude, there's profit to be made here somewhere. And that's exactly what they do. They take these, you know, these raw commodities and they process them into the, you know, 10 billion SKUs or whatever that you see that come from corn. They're turning it into really cheap beef. They're turning it into things that people either already wanted, or they're spending the money and doing the marketing research to make people want it. They're doing like the iPhone thing. Nobody asked for an iPhone, but somebody designed it around a bunch of needs that we didn't even realize we had. Agribusiness does the exact same thing, but they just do it in the worst possible way. So you have agribusiness concentrating wealth in terms of cash and stock. You have farmers who are concentrating wealth in terms of their land values and in terms of leverage. The agribusiness guys are able to lobby the same, you know, electoral bodies that farmers have basically captured in rural America. You know, you talk about red America, and that lobbying allows for basically legalized exploitation. It's why regulations around farming, as much as we might complain about, you know, the government getting in the way, and, you know, we wish that the regulations weren't so bad and food safety is kind of a joke and all this stuff, compared to other industries that I've been in, the regulations around farming are a joke. They are incredibly thin. They are really easy to navigate. They're not fun to navigate, but you know, try being like an aerospace engineer for a while, or like making pharmaceuticals for a living. Like, those are regulations. Farmers basically get to do whatever the hell they want relative to other businesses. So you wind up, you know, legally being able to exploit farm workers, being able to exploit food workers. It's how you have people during coronavirus being shipped back to JBS and basically saying, you have to work. You will get no help if you don't. And you wind up exploiting natural resources. It's all legally allowed. Farmers are able to drill wells where water tables are shrinking, where nobody else is. And there's lots and lots of examples like that. And then in the end, that's what supports our system of cheap and widely available food, is this system that we're looking at right here. And when I came into this, you know, back in 2012, 2013, nobody was talking about how complex a machine this was. Everybody was just talking about the agribusiness part and how evil they were, but nobody was talking about the dance, this kind of weird pas de deux between agribusiness and agriculture, where by and large, they've got what they want. You know, they're both wealthy in their own ways, and it's all a game to continue their power and continue their incumbency. And the whole idea behind sustainable agriculture was supposed to be, we're going to challenge this beast by having hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even millions of small farms competing in the aggregate by selling direct to market. So we're going to bypass agribusiness. We're going to farm the right way. We're going to farm sustainably. We're going to use regenerative methods, blah, blah, blah. And with enough of us, we're going to have enough of a critical mass so that we're able to, like, you know, put these guys to bed somehow. Like, nobody ever really did the math on how that was going to work. But even without doing the math, what was clear from my own story was that we did not have an environment where small farms could thrive. It was too hard to get land. And even if you could get land, it was too hard to get expertise. And even if you could get expertise, it was too hard to get labor. And even if you could get labor, it was too hard to pay them fairly to make them stick around. And even if you were able to get them to stick around, God help you when it gets to the marketing part, or when you get to the, like, you know, trying to do the business side of things, making sure you have the right insurance, enough of the right insurance, the right accountant, the right lawyer, to make sure that you are in compliance with, you know, the relatively few regulations that exist around food and agriculture. You still do have to do that. And you have to have someone that's able to do it. But the small farming model basically makes that impossible, for so many reasons. You know, the people that I came into farming with, because there were kind of a lot of us, like there was a big boom of people like around the turn of that decade that wanted to get back to the land or whatever. And there's maybe me and one other guy left standing out of like maybe the 20 farmers that I knew that were around my age that went in. So you know, if you think you're going to compete in the aggregate by having lots and lots and lots of farms to compete with this beast, but only like, you know, 1 in 10 farms are surviving when they get in, and the one that does survive is like barely hanging on, you lose. I mean, that's just what it comes down to. You are not going to win that scenario. So, you know, for us, small farming kind of turned into, it felt like nonsense. We weren't moving the needle in terms of market share. We were getting outsold at the grocery store $400 to 1. The amount of acreage that we had under our control is just laughably small. We're talking about something like 900 million acres of farmland in the United States. And even fairly large operations, if you got like a couple thousand acres, like 3,000 acres, that would be a huge regenerative agriculture outfit, and is not even a rounding error when it comes to the amount of land that needs to be restored, and the mess that we're in when it comes to food sovereignty and getting people fed and making agriculture a part of, and a part of the solution to climate change instead of a, you know, part of the problem. So we figured, you know, there's got to be a way to create an environment where small farms could thrive, and that's where our focus really shifted from, you know, let's make our farm great, you know, let's restore this little piece of land, let's make our little jewel box farm, and we're going to be happy, we're going to be perfect, and we're going to create a model that everybody else can follow. That just felt like kind of blowing sunshine up our own asses. So we said, let's shift our work to creating an economy, a food economy, at least around the Chesapeake, where not only small farms could thrive, but all of the other businesses and enterprises that are necessary for those farms to thrive, where they can thrive as well. So, you know, let's go ahead and you know, instead of just going direct, you know, to the consumer, from like, you know, the farmer to the consumer, because there's only so much a farmer can do. You know, we're going to create an integrated food economy where we have, you know, we have farms doing regenerative practices. We have, we have mills, we have processors, we have butcher shops, we have grocers, we have restaurants, we have food trucks, we have community kitchens. You know, we have the entire system composed of people who are dedicated to creating real sustainable food sovereignty instead of just trying to make as much money as possible, which is what agribusiness does now. So our farm went from, you know, this thing where we're going to be this one blob to really stepping back and saying, okay, the first priority here is to protect land and water and air. And by protecting land and water and air, sorry about my dog got issues. Protecting land and water and air under an indigenous mindset really means only doing intensive food production on a really small part of it. So if you've got 1,000 acres, you're maybe doing like quote unquote regenerative agriculture, things like mob grazing or polycultures or all the other indigenous and African tech and Asian tech that's being subsumed under this regenerative agriculture stuff. You're really only doing that on maybe like 50 acres, 60 acres. And the rest of it, you're managing more extensively. And in our area, that means agroforestry. That means making sure that the understories are clear. It means making sure that the pawpaw is growing well, the persimmon is growing well, that the oak harvests are going to be good, that the game trails are kept clean so that you can hunt the deer, and so you can hunt the turkey, and so you can have clean water where you're able to get oysters and fish and you know, live off of every part of that landscape the way my ancestors did. But not everybody can live that way. Not all of those ways are permissible under FDA guidelines and food safety guidelines. So you also want to do some integrated food production, so that you have the standard stuff, beef and pork and you know, market garden produce and all that stuff. But those kinds of intensive operations can be hard on a landscape. And there has to be a balance between the high cost that goes into, especially the labor cost that goes into producing food like that, and availing yourself, and especially availing vulnerable communities of foods that we in this country have been have been subsisting on for thousands of years. Bringing those two things together to make food more accessible to people, so you're not just feeding like rich white people in the Virginia suburbs, but so that you're able to feed the Piscataway community and the Monacan community and the Black communities that are all around DC and around Baltimore and around Richmond and the Virginia Tidewater. There's enough food out there for everybody if we're creative about how we go and get it, and if we mix up kind of the technical bag of tricks that we use to get it, and we stop thinking about food as just being something that comes from a farm. Because a thing I like to tell people is that in my language, in Lenape and Unami, there's no word for farm. It just doesn't exist. There's no concept for like drawing lines around a piece of earth and saying, we're going to grow food here and we're not going to grow food there, because there's food everywhere. Why would you draw the line? It doesn't make any sense. Like for us, that concept is like dividing by zero. But anyway, the other thing we've decided to do is get away from this idea of having the value proposition around farming being tied up in the value of land. And there's a lot of reasons. I could do a whole keynote just on that. But long story short, indigenous people, indigenizing agriculture means turning land back into a commons, especially land that has a particular value for a community. So instead of when we initially figured out, how are we going to do equitable farming? How are we going to pay living wages to farmers when people just, even paying like $13 a pound for a pork chop, you're still not going to be able to pay people what they're worth. So our initial idea had been, okay, well, why don't we do what traditional farming does, which is, Sylvanaqua farms will buy land, make everybody into a partner, and then everybody has a piece of that land as a part of their ownership. The problem is that in order to access that wealth, you have to cash out, and it incentivizes people to cash out, and that's a problem. That's basically heirs property, just like in reverse. So we decided that was kind of nonsense. So what if we decided to create a kind of nonprofit that would hold the land? And this isn't a terribly novel idea. It's a land trust. We operate ours a little bit differently than a lot of people do, but we wanted to create a land trust that would hold land in common, and that would create master plans for the development of those landscapes under a common set of ethics. So we would all agree on how the forest would be taken care of, on how the grasslands would be taken care of, how the water would be taken care of, who the communities are who are going to be served by those landscapes, and then have people come in and farm those, but have that landscape held by a land trust. And that land trust existing as part of a broader kind of nonprofit community trust, which I'll talk about a little bit more right now. So the other thing that a nonprofit can do is raise an awful lot of money really quickly, because there is a such thing as patient capital, there is a such thing as mission-oriented capital, but there's only so much of it out there. And where a lot of truly wealthy people are who are out there who want to do some kind of reparations work and help bring Black and Indigenous people back to the landscape, a lot of them need a place to write it off their taxes. So we wanted to be able to provide that. If you want to give, if you want to donate land, if you want to donate money, feel free to do that. If you don't have land, if you don't have money, but you have skills that we need, people who know how to deal with financial institutions, who know how to apply for loans, who know how to apply for grants, who know how to do accounting. We need attorneys who know how to navigate the regulatory environment. They can donate all of those services through this community food system trust that then makes them available as a set of foundational services. So you have this, this NGO that provides all of the things that tend to trip up small farmers when we get into it. So land access is the big one. Getting training is a big one. Being undercapitalized is a huge thing that trips up farmers. The bookkeeping, the accounting, the legal, the insurance, audit, the marketing, like all that stuff is what happens when you've got somebody who's passionate about, say, like biodynamics or whatever, and it comes in and they can kick ass at growing stuff, but like this other stuff just grinds them down. The idea is to marshal all these resources collectively in our region, so that they are available to individual teams of people. So not like, a person or a couple coming in to like, make their little 100 acre homestead or whatever and be self-sufficient or whatever, but have teams especially like worker-owned collectives, like those kinds of teams come in and decide that they're going to be, this one's going to be a ranch, this one's going to be a produce operation, this one's going to be a diversified ranch and produce operation. This lady over here wants to start a restaurant. This one over here wants to start a food truck. This one down here wants to start a community kitchen and a community fridge to feed the people for free or whatever. All those people need access to most of these services that are provided by this nonprofit. So the point is that you want to be able to expand the number of people who are able to come onto the landscape and do land-based enterprises and do sustainable agriculture and participate in a sustainable food system without having to do all the entrepreneurial stuff. Because if everybody that comes onto the landscape has to be a good entrepreneur in order to make it at all, we're never going to grow. You have to have someone who's willing to do the entrepreneurial stuff and make it available, make it sustainably available, and then have other people able to avail themselves of it so that they can just apply their trade, so they can be good growers, so they can be good livestock husbandmen, so they can be good chefs, so they can be good community activists, and just get all that other stuff out of the way. And so, excuse me, I'm so sorry, I'm a little bit sick. So anyhow, this is kind of the system that we've created here at Sylvanaqua Farms, where, instead of having Sylvanaqua Farms that tries to do everything, right? We don't just, we tried to do livestock ranching, we tried to do beef and pork and cattle, and we did the land management and the land lease stuff. We were the HR department, we were the accounting department, we did payroll, we did marketing, we did sales, we were responsible for meat processing, logistics, we did door-to-door deliveries. There's one tight blob of like not nearly enough people trying to do everything. We decided, okay, what if we split this off? And Sylvanaqua Farms just did what it's really good at, which is the marketing part and the processing part. And then we broke off the livestock ranch into its own thing, run by its own people, who could form, like, in our case, they're forming an intentional community that runs as a ranch, and they can grow the way they want to. They have a dedicated market to sell into that they, we're organized as an agricultural co-op. So they have seats on us. So they have a vote. So it's not like a farmer contracting with Purdue or whatever, where they just like cross their fingers and hope Purdue doesn't screw them. Like, no, they actually have ownership in this. And the livestock people are also able to come and work in the processing mills if they want to, so they can make a little extra money. And then we have a produce operation that's starting off the same way. And we've got some more people that are coming in to create a community kitchen. And sooner or later, we're going to start grocers, we're going to start mills, and just integrate the entire economy with these small, tight collectives that are loosely interconnected through basically bonds of transparency, where everyone can see everybody else's financials. Everybody knows how much everybody makes. We share seats on boards, we share seats on co-ops. So you don't wind up with this kind of hierarchical system, but you wind up with this web of people who are interrelated and interdependent in terms of how their businesses run. And if that's successful, an interesting thing could happen. And this is kind of pie in the sky, but it's what I'm going to spend like the last 6 or so minutes of my presentation on. If this works, if you create a food economy that is able to scale sustainably, that provides good jobs, or somebody that wants to come in and be a farmer, they can come in and be a farmer and get paid to be a farmer, but to make up the rest of their wage, they can work like in the food processing plant, or they can work doing distribution, or they can work in marketing, they can work doing social media to promote the thing, like whatever, figure out a way to make your career work. Because the other thing is, you're not going to be 20 years old forever, right? Eventually you might wind up kind of needing a desk job because my knees are going bad already. I'm not even 40. So, if you have enough of a real economy with a diversity of jobs and a diversity of support services where people can come in and make a living working in rural areas, you can have this crazy thing where rural repopulation actually happens. It's important to remember that the depopulation of rural areas was not an accident. It was not a force of nature. It was not a matter of physics. It was a political strategy. And we can create political strategies and economic strategies that get people back into the countryside, that get people back onto the landscape. When you have people repopulating rural areas, you'd be surprised how quickly you can start leveraging representative democracy and restoring it. So the policies and the stuff that you see coming out of municipal governments, local governments, state governments, and even the federal government actually start to reflect the will of the people again, because you actually have people living there. And gerrymandering is harder to do. and it's harder to isolate pockets of people so that, you know, this giant state has 2 senators and this other state doesn't have so many senators. I told somebody, like, you know, one of the easiest ways to balance out the Senate would be for 34,000 people to move to North Dakota, because that was the number of votes between how you wound up with you know, one senator in one party and senator in another. Like, repopulation of an area based on a functioning, diverse, and robust food economy is one of the less crazy ways of achieving electoral reform without having to, like, alter the Constitution, which is not going to happen, you know, under our current political environment. So that's a possibility. The other thing is that once you restore real representative democracy, you have a public interest that, you know, you have a government that actually works in the public interest. You have public wealth getting distributed in a way that makes sense and doesn't just reinforce incumbent wealth and incumbent privilege. But instead, you have things like community investment. You have, you know, actual movement behind land back efforts and rematriation efforts and reparational efforts, real conservation grants that are designed to actually get conservation done and not just give money to millionaires to, like, you know, keep a couple hundred acres out of production or whatever. Like, you actually have, I hate to use this word, holistically managed conservation coming out of the public interest. That's a real possibility if we're able to get rural repopulation, if we're able to create real food economies. And then finally, with all those resources being available, we have, you know, in our model, there's an idea of collective ownership. And this has been one of the big challenges that we've had, is that collective ownership is, or the idea of, you know, the workers in the system being the owners of the system. It sounds great in theory. It's really difficult to make happen on the ground because people are risk averse. We have an economy that's based on fear. People are afraid of losing their jobs. People are afraid of being made fun of on social media. Nobody wants to be a burden, especially in a place where wages are just going down and down and down and down relative to inflation. So, you know, with this fear-based economy, you can offer somebody ownership, but you'd be surprised how often that offer gets rejected in favor of, you know, I just want wages. So in our system, we kind of require that each of the businesses that are going to hook into our market and hook into our network at least offer a path to ownership, so that people have a vote and a say and a share of not only the risk, but also the rewards of what's created in that food system. But when you have wealth from the public interest going into this food economy that's owned by a plurality of people instead of just like a few, you know, kind of a few oligarchs or plutocrats or whatever, you get a society where things are distributed much more fairly and where prosperity is shared much more broadly. And I think agriculture, sustainable agriculture, and food economies are in a unique position to do this, because except for certain things like mining and timber and, like, deliberately purpose-driven extractive industries, farming is one of the few where the point is to steward a lot of land, bring a lot of people in, for a good reason. You know, to protect land, to protect air, to protect water, to protect communities, and in the process, hopefully, restore this ship that we're all in. You know, under the notion of a democracy that works and under shared prosperity. So that's what we're doing here at Sylvanaqua Farms. That's what we're after. And I hope that everybody walking away from this from this monologue of mine, I wish it was a discussion, will think more about what can I do to create an environment where sustainable food systems can thrive, instead of focusing so much on my farm, my farm, my farm. We're really going to have to start thinking collectively and really not just demonstrating to people like how, you know, how this can work for you, but building something and then saying, offering a hand and saying, come with me and let's do this together. Because going back to my roots, my indigenous roots, my Choctaw roots, agriculture, farming, food systems, none of that could be divorced from the happiness and health of the community as a whole. You know, there was just no happiness without taking care of the natural resources first. And that had to be done together. there was no private property for a reason. So that's all I'll say about that. I think I'm out of time. I'm going to open up this chat real quick just to be sure. Okay, yeah, I think we're good. Thank you, everybody. You can see us on sylvanaqua.com, and bye-bye.
Say that thank you, Chris, and thank you for thank you, Aqua Fund, for sponsoring our keynote.
Thank you very much. You've given us, as you always do, a lot to think about.
We hadn't set for us to come back at this time because it's time for everybody to go to the next workshops, which will start at 10 a.m. I put a message in the chat box if you want to see more from Chris and Sylvanaqua. Check out the exhibitor, A Growing Culture, in the exhibitor hall. There are a lot of great videos and recordings of Chris doing presentations for them as well. They did a really great Juneteenth event. And now on to our next workshop.